Let's get right to it. I'm going to show you how to assemble and install all three sizes of the Twin Turbo Vise. So we're going to build the traveling jaw of the vise first, and this is your starting point because I assume all of you know how to dimension lumber. This is two pieces of wood that match the bench, and the length is however wide you want the vise to be. In my case, I want it to be as wide as the bench, plus just a little bit, maybe an eighth that you'll sand down to. Now the width of these pieces should be the thickness of the bench plus 3.5 inches for the 14-inch vise, bench thickness plus 4.5 inches for the 20-inch vise, and bench thickness plus 5.25 inches for the 24-inch vise. And the thickness for all of the vices should be 1.125 inches. So I put the back plate on one of the pieces, flush on the bottom and centered, and roughly mark out the location of the two pipes in the back plate. Next I drill those locations out with about 1.5 inch bit so that the 1-inch pipes can drop through. And then mark the perimeter of the back plate and cut it on the bandsaw. And since this edge is going to be visible with the acrylic front, I sand it and clean it up a bit to make it more presentable. Next, those two pieces can be glued together, taking care to clean up, squeeze out before it dries. Now in the next step, the back plate of the vise is going to continue to serve as a template to lay everything out. So put the two bushings in the pipes that fit snugly, and use a 3/4 inch bit to mark the center of the pipes. The 3/4 inch bit is a good fit with the inside diameter of that bushing in the back of the pipe. Then first drill down about 1/8 inch with a large diameter drill bit, about 1.5 inches. This is to relieve the wood that would interfere with the weld on the back of the back plate. And then drill in the center at 1 inch for the rest of the pipe. And you may have to sand a little bit out of this hole on a spindle sander or by hand just to make room, because you want the back plate to drop in without any resistance. You don't want to be forcing it, because if you're forcing it, then you're putting a force on the pipes and you might be pushing them out of parallel. And next, mark the locations of all 7 penetrations in the back plate. Now use a 3/4 inch diameter bit to drill the 3 in the middle. The outer 2 you want to drill down 3/4 inch. On the middle one you don't need to go down that far. 1/2 inch is more than enough. The outer 4 drill down 1 inch, so almost all the way through, with a 7/32 inch bit. Next we're going to use this Eagle America thread tap to tap some holes, but before just getting into it, a word on that real quick. So the tap you're going to need is the 5/16 inch tap. This is normally $28. It is on sale, significantly discounted right now, down to $18. And if you use the discount code TAPS-AK, you get an additional 10% off that. So this is the cheapest you'll ever be able to pick one of these taps specifically designed for wood. My intent is this video lasts indefinitely as my instruction video for the vise. The sale will not last indefinitely, so if it's past December of 2019, you missed your chance on that tap. So if you are in time, I'd recommend taking advantage of it. So time to do some tapping. Now I will say the risk with an operation like this where you drilled almost all the way through is that you can just blow right through the back of the wood. So I would do a couple test cuts, get comfortable with this, maybe set the drill up so that, just like with the screw functionality, so you don't strip out screws, it starts to spin without actually turning the bit if it encounters extra resistance. So especially if this is a new operation to you, practice it a bit. Now this next step is technically optional, but I think it's a good idea. Cut a strip of wood to 1.25 inches, and we're going to double stick tape it onto the traveling jaw of the vise where the base of the back plate would be. And so at 1.25 inches it's going to be proud of the top surface by 1/8 inch. So when we turn it around and send it through a planer, it'll remove the bottom of the inside of the jaw at an angle, and this compensates for the little bit of top to bottom racking that you're going to have with a vise that has the screws mounted several inches below the top of the workbench. So if you want this vise to really look its best, some elbow grease is required. But I want to show you how to get the best bang for your effort. And I think that what I'm doing here is a pretty good payoff, because it really only takes about 2 minutes to use a wire brush and a drill just to get a good brushed finish on the visible side of the backplate. Now probably you should clamp yours down. You see mine moving around. It can't move too far because of the welding table, but anyway, be smarter than me and throw a clamp on there if you do this. But it's a pretty quick operation, and I think it definitely does look a lot better than the surface that you're going to see just coming right out of the box. And this is one of those things when I'm designing the tool and trying to make some decisions that involve a trade-off between the effort you need to put in and the cost you're going to need to pay. This just seemed like a pretty good payoff, rather than spending money on a finish from the factory and really complicating things, and then all the packaging needs to make sure I'm preserving that finish. It adds quite a lot of cost and complexity if I try to do that for a 2-minute operation, that you can come in and do a water-based top coat and protect it from rust in maybe another minute. So we're talking about a 3-minute operation. It just seemed like a good trade-off. So that's why I made the decision to have it shipped in kind of a raw state for you to fix up. But okay, we're moving on to vise assembly. The next step is to push this retaining ring onto the groove in this pin. Now this is the groove close to the square end. It should fit snugly, and it's pretty easy just to push on against a piece of wood or table or something. Next step, find 5 each of these small screws and washers and screw them into the only gear that you find with 5 spokes. This is true for all 3 of the vise sizes. You may notice on this gear that one of the sides is a bit more presentable than the other. You want to screw these into the more presentable of the 2 sides, because that's the side that's going to be visible. Next, find this small bushing. Now there should be 5 of these. You're going to use one of these on the back of that 5-spoked gear. So the flange goes on the opposite side from the screws, and the pin goes in the middle with the retaining ring holding it in place. Then you use this screw, there's only one of these, to screw it all in place once you have the square end of the peg in the back plate. And if you did it all right, that gear should spin freely. Now for the next step, you need to locate 8 of these small screws, 8 small spacers, and 4 gears, each with 4 spokes. Set the smaller of the 2 gears down first and put the 4 spacers over the 4 threaded holes on that gear. Then set the larger gear on top with the countersinks facing up, put the screws in, and screw them together. Now you want to first use light pressure on all of the screws, because you're relying on that thread and countersink to pull these gears into alignment. So if you torque one of the screws down too hard, then the other ones might not be able to get the alignment good. So make sure light pressure first, then kind of tighten them all up slowly and sequentially to make sure you have really good alignment here. So when you're done, you'll have 2 sets of 2 gears, so just repeat the process. Okay, now it's time to assemble the screws. Find these 4 bushings that fit in the pipes and put them on either side and slip the screws in from the back. Now put this washer over the end of the screw, and then find this funny looking end cap that's temporarily there to install this retaining ring. So put the retaining ring on the cone of that installation cap as far as it can go, and next the handle of the vise is going to be what you use to install this retaining ring. Now you'll notice that one of the ends of this pipe is not milled and the other one is milled. So you're going to first start with the unmilled section with a smaller inside diameter and push that retaining ring on as far as it can go. Then turn the handle around and use the milled section with the bigger diameter to finish installing and pushing that retaining ring onto its groove. Make sure it's fully seated. If you get this right, it's very strong, but make sure the entire retaining ring is in that groove and everything's seated correctly. And also make sure you didn't forget that washer, because once you have this on, you can fish it out with a needle nose pliers, but it's not the easiest thing in the world. So double check that you did this installation right before pushing that retaining ring in place. Okay, back to gear assembly. You're going to need the 4 remaining small bushings and 2 standoffs with the thicker walls. You have 4 of these with thin walls. You want the 2 with thick walls for this. So those go inside of the 2 gear sets with the flanges of the bushings on the outside. And those 2 gear sets line up with the big gear in front on either side of that center gear. Okay, so this next part's important. Listen closely. You need to make sure that the 2 big gears are aligned the same way and that this little hole on both of the gears is pointed in the exact same direction as they spin around. If you don't do this, the transmission won't work. So make sure you get that right. Next, I'm going to tell you how to install the nuts and bushings for the vise screws on the bottom of your workbench. But working from the bottom of the bench is awkward, so I'm just going to show it like this. So we start with the nut and bushing for one screw and use a square to make a line that will line up the inside edge of that screw and bushing to make sure that it's in line. And we're placing that line 5 7/8 inches from the center for the 14-inch vise, 8 7/8 inches for the 20-inch vise, and 10 7/8 inches for the 24-inch vise. And there should be about a 3-inch gap between the nut and bushing. That's not critical, just aim for something close to that. Mark the location of the tapped holes for the nut and bushing screws. I use a brad point bit and just find the biggest one that I have that still fits into the holes. For me, this was 11/32. So I mark those locations, drill and tap just like in the earlier step to mount the nut and bushing. Now to locate the second nut and bushing, I find it helpful to cut a piece of scrap to use as a reference to make sure they're really in line relative to the first set that you installed. And the length of that piece of scrap is 11 3/4 for the 14-inch vise, 17 3/4 for the 20-inch vise, and 21 3/4 for the 24-inch vise. Now, if you're worried about wood movement on your bench, either if it's wet wood initially or if you have a lot of seasonal variation, the larger 2 vices do come with these mounting bars that allow you to bolt the nut and bushing to the bar, and then the bar is what gets screwed to the bench. And the outer holes on that mounting bar are slotted so that it stays in the same position even if the bench is moving a bit. I have a bit more to say about these mounting bars, but I'm going to save that for the end of the video. Okay, back to the vise. Find 2 of 6 identical large flathead screws and thread them into the holes behind the 2 stacked gear sets. Just thread them lightly by hand just to keep them in place. Now this is a temporary setup just to get the alignment of the vise correct to make sure that it's parallel with the bench. So thread the screws into the nuts and set the vise up so that the distance on either side is exactly the same. And then once you've done that, without turning the screws, put the 2 outer gears in place around the square ends of the 2 screws. And now with that all done, make 2 marks, one on the top of the gear and one on the top of the screw. When you put this all back together, if you line those up, everything will be parallel and exactly how you want it. On the back of the gears, label left and right so you don't mix those up. Now with the vise back off the bench, put everything back together the way you had it with those dots lined up together and pointed up. You can take the 2 screws out of the middle gear assemblies, Put these two washers on the ends of the screws and then put the front plate of the vise on. Make sure that all the gears are meshed together. I actually have a misalignment on the left that I'm not noticing, but it causes me a little trouble later. And also, if you use a power tool to tighten up these two screws, be very careful that you don't over torque them and damage the acrylic. Even though they're not supposed to be tight on the acrylic, you do want them firmly in place, so thread these two nuts on the back and tighten the nut against the back of the plate to lock it firmly in place without putting undue stress on the acrylic. So when I turn the handle here and the gears pop into place, I think that misalignment is what caused the gear to scratch the inside of the acrylic. So just be careful of issues like that. So next it's time to put this spring detent into the handle. Now this is what keeps the vise in gear and from popping back into neutral. So just tighten it up until it's registering with the grooves in the center pin, the first thing that you installed on the vise. If it's too hard to shift, then loosen it out a little bit. It should keep things in place but not be so tight that it's difficult to transition from high to low speed. Now we can put the handle back together in the center hub with those rubber washers to keep the handle from banging too much when it slides from one position to the next. Pretty self-explanatory. The threaded rod just goes through the handle to hold the two knobs on either side. And I use some channel locks just to get these really good and tight so they're not going to come apart unless I want them to. Now it's time to do a friction test. Make sure everything's working. So put the vise in high gear and low gear. In each of those positions, if you hold the handle out to the side, it should drop to the middle. It's not doing this, something's rubbing. I'm simulating that here with a little shop towel just to show you that that's enough friction to keep the vise up. I pull it out and it drops. So it's a good check to make sure that everything's aligned and working right at this point. Now it's time to combine the vise and the wood jaw with these thin-walled standoffs and the 4 additional flathead screws. Put the spacers in between the 2 plates of the vise with the screw through the middle. Drop the whole thing into the wood jaw and tighten the screws into the threads that you cut in the wood. Once you've done that, everything should be just as smooth as it was in the previous step. If it isn't, there's some misalignment, something's not wrong, you're going to have to troubleshoot and figure out what it is. And you've got yourself a vise. This is done except for sanding and flushing up the sides and top. That's pretty self-explanatory. I think you can figure it out. If not, you probably haven't got this far anyway. So, doesn't matter. That's it. Vise done. Now, if you thought I looked and sounded tired in this video, it's because I am, and that's because I've been busting my tail packing and shipping twin turbo vices. I've shipped over 100. I've got another 100 packed up and ready to ship, and that pace should be accelerating. I've really refined my methods and got through a lot of stuff that was slowing me down. So the rest of November should be really fast. Some of the initial folks who've already received their vices didn't get shipping notifications. I think I've got that all sorted out. So before your vice arrives, you should get a shipping notification that it's on its way. I'd mentioned that I wanted to talk about these mounting bars for the 20 and 24-inch vices. And that's because I am working on a pivot mount that would allow the twin turbo vise to clamp angled pieces and really improve the versatility of the vise. That is an optional add-on. I'll have manufacturing costs figured out and open a pre-sale in about a month. So hang tight if you're interested in that. But it will also mitigate any kind of bench movement issues, so it's redundant. If you ordered a 20 or 24-inch vise and you know you're going to get that pivot mount, it would be very helpful if you could let me know that you don't need the hardware and mounting bar, because these are actually fairly expensive. So it would help me out a lot, and maybe get your vise a little quicker if you tell me you don't need these. No pressure. If you do need them, don't feel guilty. Even if you think you might need them, no worries. Totally optional and voluntary. If you're sure you don't need these, either your bench is completely stable or you know you're going to get that pivot mount, then send me an email, link in description, and let me know. And I never really close things out with the camera, so bye, I guess.